1945.
The battleship Missouri, 53,000-ton flagship of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, becomes the scene of an unforgettable ceremony marking the complete and formal surrender of Japan.
Folks, on August 15th, 1945, having suffered the only nuclear bomb attack in history only a few days previously, the Japanese government finally surrendered.
As Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, I announce it my firm purpose, in the tradition of the countries I represent, to proceed in the discharge of my responsibilities with justice and tolerance, while taking all necessary dispositions to ensure that the terms of surrender are fully, promptly, and faithfully complied with.
At that moment, Japan was a defeated country. Its economy was shattered and the Japanese had suffered unimaginable damage. Not only were they immersed in extreme poverty, they'd also lost more than 3 million compatriots. Brothers, sons, even mothers. War, it takes a terrible toll. With this grim picture as the situation in 1945, the question that we might ask ourselves is, well, how did Japan manage to become one of the greatest economic powers on the planet in such a short amount of time? How did the Japanese recover so quickly with such might?
It's a song.
面白い夏休みしよう
Dear viewer, here on VisualPolitik, we've already talked about the differences between the German model and the Japanese model. We've also told you about how Japan transformed from a medieval country to a thriving modern nation. However, we still need to answer the question of how Japan managed to become a great world power in just a few years. Let me tell you right now that the Japanese model is rather peculiar, so we're going to need more than one video to explain it here. In this video, we're going to see a few brush strokes in the whole picture, but don't worry, more chapters are absolutely going to follow.
The post-war.
In 1945, it seemed like everything that had been built after the Meiji Restoration of 1868 had simply evaporated. Moreover, as if that weren't enough, for the first time in its history, Japan was occupied by the United States. But hold on for just a second, because it wasn't all bad news. As we'll see, the Japanese also had 3 aces up their sleeves, 3 characteristics that would launch their country into the stratosphere, turning it into one of the richest countries on the planet. And that's all in spite of the many political mistakes that both the occupation forces and the local authorities would make over the coming years. So, you want to know what the 3 ingredients were, the main ingredients of this Japanese success recipe? Well, first of all, a huge ability and predilection for saving. You see, in Asian countries in general, and Japan is no exception, families try to save every penny, much more so than almost any other place on Earth. Why? Well, there are many explanations for this phenomena. Cultural preference, a trend towards less consumption in the present in order to spend more in the future, or just because of a lack of public services, which tend to be very limited in this part of the world. All of these explanations may have a bit of truth to them, but regardless, these huge amounts of savings are then invested, which creates productive capital that obviously leads to higher production and wealth levels.
It's savings that allow us to direct our efforts for a long time, not to satisfy our immediate needs, but to worry about satisfying our future needs. We produce capital goods so that they, in turn, manufacture the future consumer goods we may need. Juan Ramon Rayo.
Alright, so the first ace that Japan had up its sleeve after the war was an enormous propensity to save. Savings, savings, and just more savings. The second, it had a lot to do with the Meiji Restoration of 1868. You see, as we saw in a previous video, one of the first things the Japanese government did after the regime change was bet on creating a very powerful educational system. They established universal primary education and promoted universities, academies, research centers, etc. Thus, after the Second World War, despite their situation, the Japanese were the most well-trained workers on the entire Asian continent. And of course, this entails a huge competitive advantage. But also, one of the first measures taken after the war was pushing the educational system even further. And so what's the third card? Well, is the one you could probably guess, and that's the Japanese's huge capacity and willingness for working long hours. And in some cases, they've even taken things right to the extreme. I mean, do you know any other country in the world that has a word for death from working too much?
Karoshi, death from working too much, is a public health problem in Japan.
The fact is that all three of these factors, they gave Japan a huge capacity to recover, grow, and create a great deal of wealth. But hold on a second, because, well, having seen all of this, what exactly are the stages that Japan goes through in order for this economic miracle to happen? Well, listen up.
しかし出代わりに大勢の明日からはもっと早く
The stages.
The process we're about to explore starts with the US's occupation of Japan after the end of the war. See, the occupation forces had two major priorities: to demilitarize and democratize Japan. It's around this time, for example, that the new constitution establishing a democratic system was created. It equalized men's and women's rights, and it stripped Japan of its right to wage war, dismantling its armed forces. In addition, the occupation forces copied US institutions and launched reforms that had some benefits and many drawbacks. I think one day we're going to need to talk about how badly the military has always managed the economy of countries they've controlled, but that's something we'll deal with in a future video. The fact is that the priority of these reforms was to eliminate, or at least to reduce, the power of the oligarchs who supported Japanese expansionism and militarism. To do so, the sale of lands from big landowners to small farmers, it was approved. Measures were taken to dissolve the zaibatsu, large business groups that engaged in many activities but were controlled by a single family. An antitrust law that outlawed monopolies was also passed in 1947, and the unionization of workers was also promoted. Everything was done with the intention of achieving an economic power change. Of course, some of these measures, in addition to limiting the power of the great oligarchs, also had some rather positive consequences. For example, the land distribution managed to turn many farmers into owners. The demise of many of these zaibatsu led to the emergence of many small and medium-sized enterprises. In spite of everything, the recovery, it was much slower than expected. However, in the 1950s, the country had, as it were, a stroke of luck. The Korean War turned Japan into one of the Alliance Forces suppliers, thereby boosting their exports and their production. Suddenly, Japanese companies and politicians, they discovered the great global market. In 1953, production levels had already surpassed the levels there'd been right before the war, and the political class had a new priority: boosting economic growth through business.
The Economic Takeoff.
Folks, the decades of the 50s, 60s, and 70s were miraculous years. They were Japan's golden age. It was a time led by the Liberal Democratic Party, a political party that ruled the country for almost 40 uninterrupted years. A few years ago, by the way, it was discovered that the CIA actually gave a lot of money to support the party's political campaigns. This is also the party of the current Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe. The fact is that this party launched a very peculiar system. See, on the one hand, it promoted policies that favored saving, keeping inflation under control, and slowing down the growth of the public sector, as well as maintaining low taxes and avoiding the accumulation of debt. This is the opposite of what they do in countries like Argentina or Italy, for example. However, hold on just a second, because that's not all. Now, on the other hand, unlike what happens in other countries that achieved great economic takeoff, the truth is that these governments, they were quite interventionist. For example, they decided to promote certain industries which they themselves chose and which they helped grow from within the government itself. They also promoted a new cartelization of national companies, supposedly to avoid what they considered to be excessive competition. Although, I don't really know here, but that just sure sounds like a way for them to help out their friends. Regardless, it did have amazing results. In the early 1960s, Prime Minister Hayato Akita announced a plan to double the size of Japan's economy in just 10 years. To reach this goal, the country needed to maintain an annual average growth rate of 7.2% for that entire time. International analysts considered it impossible. 10 years later, Japan had far exceeded its goal. The country had multiplied the size of its economy by 2.8 because it had an average annual growth rate of more than 9.3%. Thus, in 1973, the Japanese economy had multiplied more than 5 since 1953. That is, in just 20 years. On the other hand, GDP per capita multiplied by 4, and within a few years, Japan became the largest asset holder in the world and the largest humanitarian aid provider. Even the Tokyo Stock Exchange managed to outperform the New York Stock Exchange for a short period of time. But you know what? This is when a great controversy arose. On one side, some defended the country's spectacular growth despite all of these government policies. That is to say that the three things we covered at the beginning of this video, savings, work, and training, were so strong that they managed to take off in spite of the government's interference. But some argue that since the government kept the macroeconomic parameters under control, these public policies actually accelerated the country's growth. Now the only question is, which one do you think is right? Which group do you belong to? Well, leave your answer in the comments section below and also in this survey. What there's little doubt about, though, is that it was exactly during that time that some of the greatest imbalances that led the country into a huge crisis from which it hasn't yet recovered emerged. But we already talked about that in this previous other video. So, well, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.
That the terms of surrender are fully, promptly,